The county of Eastwich was a place where old secrets festered like mold in damp stone. And no secret was more stubbornly persistent than the one clinging to Blackwood Manor. Perched on a desolate hill overlooking the town, the house was a Gothic skeleton, its windows like empty eyes staring out from a decaying face. For as long as anyone could remember, it had been home to the Blackwood sisters, Eleanor and Clara. Their name was a byword for a kind of polite madness, a quiet strangeness that kept them as isolated as if a moat of poison had been dug around their property. No one truly knew their ages, but their presence felt ancient. They were rarely seen outside the manor's wrought iron gates, and when they were, it was only for essential provisions, a swift, hooded dash into town and back again. Rumors were their only currency in the community. Some said they were witches, descendants of a line of sorceresses who had fled Europe. Others whispered that their beauty was a curse, a gift from a demon they had imprisoned in the manor's very walls. The most popular tale, however, revolved around their disparate obsessions. Eleanor, the elder, with her strange and bulky camera, and Clara, the younger, with her morbid paintings of sorrowful figures. The manor itself was a character in the local folklore, a place of broken promises and half-finished projects. The gardens were choked with weeds, and the grand old oak in the front yard had long ago died, its limbs reaching towards the sky like skeletal fingers. The silence that hung over the place was a living thing, broken only by the cawing of crows and the occasional mournful howl of the wind. In the late autumn of 1898, this silence was more profound than ever, a heavy blanket that seemed to be drawing the last breaths of the Blackwood sisters into its cold embrace. The townspeople felt it, too, a premonition that the quiet was about to break, and whatever had been hidden in the manor for so long was finally ready to emerge. The whispers of Blackwood Manor eventually found their way to the ears of Mr. Silas Abernathy, a man whose ambition was as sharp as the focus on his camera lens. Abernathy was not a local man. He had traveled from Boston with his latest large-format camera, a marvel of brass and polished mahogany. He had heard the tales of the Blackwood sisters and, rather than being deterred, he was intrigued. To him, they were not witches or madwomen, but subjects, a living testament to a forgotten way of life, a perfect portrait of quiet decay. He saw an opportunity for a photograph so unique it would secure his reputation for years to come. His initial attempts to contact them were met with a polite but firm silence. A letter he sent was never answered, and his approach to the manor's gate was met with the unwavering, hostile stare of an old housekeeper who simply shook her head and disappeared back inside. Abernathy was not one to be easily discouraged. He spent days sketching the manor from a distance, studying the patterns of the sisters' rare outings, and trying to deduce the best way to present his proposition. He was a patient predator, stalking his elusive prey with a sense of artistic purpose. He learned that Eleanor, the elder sister, was the true gatekeeper of their isolation. It was she who handled the rare interactions with the outside world, she who gave the orders, and she who, according to the local gossip, was the more formidable of the two. Abernathy knew that if he was to gain entry, he would have to appeal to her sensibilities. He would not offer money, he would offer art. He would show her his work, explain his craft, and convince her that a photograph of the Blackwood sisters was not a violation of their privacy but a preservation of their legacy. He decided his next attempt would be a direct one, a bold approach to the front door, a move that flew in the face of every cautionary tale he had been told. He would not be denied. The bold approach was met with a silence so complete it felt like a physical barrier. Mr. Abernathy had knocked, waited, and knocked again, his hand growing numb in the cold. Just as he was about to turn away, a small, worn envelope was slipped through the mail slot at the bottom of the door. There was no greeting, no apology for the delay, just a single precisely written sentence. Come tomorrow at 3. You may bring your camera. It was not a welcome, but a command. It was signed with an elegant, almost spidery hand, E. Blackwood. Abernathy's triumph was short-lived, replaced by a profound unease. The note was not just an invitation, it felt like a test, a gauntlet thrown down by the reclusive Eleanor. The brief, cold message carried the weight of 100 unspoken warnings. It told him that this would not be a typical photographic session, a simple matter of posing and clicking a shutter. It hinted at a formality, a ritual he did not yet understand. He spent the rest of the day preparing his equipment, cleaning his lenses, and carefully organizing his plates. He felt the nervous energy of a man on the eve of a duel. The whispers he had dismissed as local folklore now felt more real, the bizarre rumors about the sisters' obsessions and the manor's dark history taking on a sinister weight. He knew that the photograph he sought would be a masterpiece, but he also sensed that the price of it might be more than he was prepared to pay. As he laid out his tools, a chilling thought crossed his mind. Was he the artist seeking his subject, or was he, in some strange way, the one being invited into a carefully constructed trap? The next day would provide the answer. The sound of the heavy oak door creaking open was the only welcome Mr. Abernathy received as he stood on the threshold of Blackwood Manor. The air inside was thick and cold, a mix of old paper, dust, and something else he couldn't quite place, something like ozone after a lightning strike. The grand hall was a sepulchre of faded glory, lined with dark, peeling wallpaper and portraits of long-dead ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow his every move. His boots echoed on the cold marble floor as he was led through a labyrinth of hallways by the silent housekeeper. They arrived at what was clearly the heart of the sisters' world, a sprawling, high-ceilinged room at the back of the house. Sunlight streamed in through a grimy, multi-paned window, illuminating dancing motes of dust in the air. The space was a peculiar blend of artistic chaos and scientific precision. Canvases, some finished, some half-done, were stacked haphazardly against the walls, depicting twisted trees and mournful figures in a muted palette of grays and blues. In a corner, a long table was cluttered with jars of pigments, solvents and brushes, alongside what appeared to be strange, botanical drawings. Eleanor Blackwood stood at the center of it all, a stark figure in a dark, floor-length dress. Her posture was ramrod straight, and her hands were clasped at her waist. Abernathy felt her gaze the moment he stepped into the room. It was not a welcoming stare, but an appraising, almost clinical one, as if she were cataloguing his every detail for later study. Her face, framed by dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, was beautiful but lacked any hint of warmth. She did not smile, did not offer a hand to shake. She simply pointed to a spot on the floor and said, "Place your things there. We have little time." Her voice, low and clear, was the sound of authority, an echo of the command he had received in her note. This was her domain, and he was nothing more than an invited component in a larger, as yet undisclosed experiment. Eleanor's pronouncement was followed by a rustle from a dark corner of the room. Out of the shadows emerged a second figure, so pale and slight that Mr. Abernathy had not noticed her before. This was Clara, the younger of the two sisters. Unlike Eleanor's stern, unyielding presence, Clara seemed to be made of fragility and sorrow. Her dark dress hung on her slender frame, and her face was a study in quiet melancholy. Her eyes, large and shadowed, were not fixed on Abernathy but rather on the floor, as if a profound weight lay upon her shoulders. She carried a small, leather-bound sketchbook clutched against her chest. Abernathy's trained eye quickly assessed her. She was a ghost in her own home, a delicate echo of her sister's forceful nature. He saw the same bone structure, the same aristocratic nose, but where Eleanor's features were sharp and defined, Clara's were softened by an immense sadness. The tension between the two was as palpable as the dust in the air. Eleanor commanded the space, while Clara seemed to shrink from it, her every movement a hesitant apology for her existence. While Eleanor began to meticulously arrange the camera equipment, Abernathy found his gaze drawn to Clara's sketchbook. She opened it to a random page, her thumb tracing the lines of a drawing. It was a charcoal sketch of a human figure, but the details were disturbing. The face was blank, the eyes mere hollows, and the hands were sketched with a translucent, almost ghostly quality. It was not a portrait of a person, but of an absence. Before he could say a word, Eleanor's sharp voice cut through the silence. "Focus on your task, Mr. Abernathy. You are here to take a picture, not to pry." Clara quickly snapped the sketchbook shut and returned to the shadows. Her brief, silent communication, a clear warning that there was much more to their story than met the eye. As Mr. Abernathy began to unpack his own equipment, His professional focus was momentarily broken by Eleanor's own large-format camera. It was a magnificent, imposing object, far older and more intricate than his own. The wood was a rich, dark cherry, and the brass fittings were tarnished with age. But it was not its appearance that held his attention, it was the way Eleanor handled it. She did so with a strange, almost reverent affection, as if it were a living thing. She didn't simply set up the tripod, she adjusted its legs with an unnerving precision, her movements deliberate and ritualistic. He noticed other peculiar details. The lens was not the standard glass he was accustomed to but a murky, almost opaque crystal. She didn't use the usual light meter but held a small, polished stone to the windowpane, her eyes fixed on the way the light refracted through it. When she reached for her photographic plates, he saw they were not the typical glass negatives but something else entirely. Thin, dark pieces of what looked like polished slate, etched with faint, unfamiliar symbols. "My methods are unique," she said, her voice cutting through the silence as she noticed his scrutiny. "They are not for the faint of heart, nor for the uninitiated." Abernathy, a man of science and logic, felt a shiver run down his spine. The air in the room seemed to crackle with an unseen energy, and he suddenly felt a profound sense of being out of his depth. This wasn't photography as he knew it. This was something older, something that whispered of alchemy and forgotten sciences. He had come to capture a portrait, but now he was beginning to suspect he was an unwitting participant in a much more arcane ritual, one where the final image might hold far more than just a likeness. Eleanor moved with a singular, terrifying focus. She positioned Clara in a high-backed velvet armchair, its faded upholstery a stark contrast to her sister's pale face. Clara sat rigidly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes cast down. Her expression was not one of patience but of profound resignation, as if she were a statue waiting to be carved. Eleanor then carefully placed a book, thick and bound in what looked like dark leather, on Clara's lap, its pages unmarked. "Look at me," Eleanor commanded, her voice devoid of emotion. Clara's eyes lifted slowly, meeting Abernathy's gaze for a fleeting moment. In that instant, he saw not a person, but a plea for help. Eleanor ignored this silent exchange. She took her position behind her massive camera, her hands moving over its controls with a dancer's grace. She did not look through the viewfinder. Instead, she brought a small, silver locket to her lips and whispered an incantation, the words too soft and foreign for Abernathy to understand. A faint, low hum emanated from the camera's dark body, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. The light in the room, already dim, began to shift, casting strange, elongated shadows. Abernathy watched, frozen, his own camera forgotten by his side. This was no ordinary portrait session. It was a ceremony. He could feel the temperature drop several degrees. A powerful, unseen force seemed to be gathering in the room, centering on the dark lens and the two silent women. Eleanor's face, in profile, was a mask of cold determination, her every muscle focused on the task at hand. The hum grew louder, more insistent, and the air crackled with a palpable energy. Abernathy felt his skin prickle, a mix of fear and an almost magnetic pull towards the spectacle. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the photograph about to be taken would not simply capture an image. It would capture something else entirely. The hum reached a fever pitch, a high-pitched whine that seemed to resonate not in Abernathy's ears but in his very bones. As Eleanor's hand moved to press the shutter release, a searing white flash erupted from the lens of her camera. It was not the crisp, brief burst of magnesium he was accustomed to. This was a blinding, sustained pulse of light that filled the room, a light that seemed to swallow all color and detail, leaving only a stark, ethereal landscape. The air grew impossibly cold, and Abernathy felt his breath catch in his throat, a sense of profound shock and terror gripping him. In the brief, terrifying moment the light held, he saw things that defied all logic. He saw not Clara and Eleanor, but two ghostly outlines, their bodies semi-transparent. He could see through their forms to the faint, warped outlines of the objects behind them, the canvases, the furniture, the wall itself. Their faces, caught in the otherworldly glare, were no longer human. Eleanor's was a mask of cold triumph, but Clara's face was a tableau of pure, unadulterated fear, a silent scream frozen in time. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the light vanished. The room plunged back into its dusty half-light, the silence now thicker and more oppressive than before. Eleanor stepped back from the camera, her posture relaxed, her task complete. The air still held the faint, metallic scent of ozone. Abernathy was left standing there, his heart hammering against his ribs, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. It had been more than a photograph. It had been an event, a violent, almost spiritual act that had consumed the very souls of the two women. The picture had been taken, but at what cost? He felt an urgent need to leave, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the unholy relic that now sat silent in the center of the room. The spell broken, Mr. Abernathy found himself able to move again. He didn't waste a moment. He gathered his own photographic equipment with clumsy, trembling hands, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and fear. Eleanor stood silent, watching him, her face impassive. She offered no words, no explanation, only a cool nod of dismissal. Abernathy, too, had nothing to say. There was no polite farewell to be made after what he had just witnessed. He simply turned and fled, the heavy door of Blackwood Manor closing behind him with a final, echoing thud. The walk back to his rented room in Eastwich was a blur. The cold autumn air did little to clear his head. The image of Clara's terrified face, caught in that unnatural flash, was seared into his mind. He kept replaying the moment, the hum, the light, the sight of their translucent forms. Was it a trick of the light? A chemical reaction he couldn't comprehend? His logical mind, the one that prided itself on reason and scientific precision, fought to find a rational explanation. But his gut, the primal part of him that was screaming in terror, knew better. It had been something else entirely, something ancient and malevolent. Back in the solitude of his room, he felt a profound sense of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by a gnawing dread. He had the plates from his own camera, but they felt insignificant now. The one image that mattered, the one he had come for, was not his to own. And yet, he felt a connection to it, an obligation to understand its dark power. He knew he could not simply leave. The photograph of the Blackwood sisters was no longer just a potential masterpiece. It was a haunting question, a silent secret that he, and he alone, had witnessed. He felt an obligation, a terrible pull, to return to the manor, not for art, but for answers. Mr. Abernathy returned to his own darkroom, a temporary space he had set up in his rented room, a small sanctuary of order and science. He worked by the dim red light of his safe light, his hands still unsteady from the encounter. He had no plate from Eleanor's camera, but the image he had witnessed was seared into his mind, an afterimage of terror and unreality. He decided to develop one of his own plates, a portrait he had taken in town just before his visit to the manor, hoping the familiar routine would calm his nerves. He went through the practiced motions, immersing the glass plate in the developing solution. He watched as the latent image slowly, predictably, began to appear. A man's face, a sharp collar, the familiar background of a town street. It was perfect. It was normal. But the normality only served to highlight the profound strangeness of what he had seen. He could not shake the memory of the Blackwood sisters. He imagined their plate, submerged in a similar solution, somewhere in the cold, silent manor. What would emerge from that dark chemical bath? Would it be the image he had seen with his own eyes? The haunting thought compelled him to think of the impossible. He pictured the plate in his mind, its surface slowly revealing the ghastly details he had glimpsed in the flash. Clara's face, a mask of silent anguish, and Eleanor's cold, triumphant gaze. He pictured the way their hands had seemed to fade, becoming translucent, as if they were already halfway to non-existence. The more he thought, the more convinced he became that what he had seen was not an illusion. It was a truth captured, a secret laid bare. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the photograph of the Blackwood sisters was not a mere picture. It was a prison. Sleep was an impossibility. The image of the sisters, frozen in that unnatural light, replayed in his mind's eye like a ghastly zoetrope. Mr. Abernathy tossed and turned, tormented by the certainty that he had been an accomplice in something terrible. He could not, in good conscience, leave Blackwood Manor's secret to fester. Driven by a desperate need to confirm his fears, he rose before dawn, packed a few essentials, and set off once more towards the house on the hill. As he neared the manor, a heavy mist clung to the ground, giving the dilapidated house an even more spectral appearance. The silent, skeletal trees seemed to reach out to him, their branches like skeletal fingers warning him away. The air was still and cold, an eerie contrast to the warmth of his recent anxieties. He approached the wrought iron gates, finding them ajar. This was an immediate and unnerving sign. The sisters, famous for their reclusiveness, would never have left their gates open. He felt a deep sense of foreboding, a feeling that this was not a place he should be entering. He stepped onto the long, winding gravel drive. The crunch of the stones beneath his feet was the only sound in the oppressive silence. The house stood before him, its empty windows staring out from the gloom. It no longer looked like a home but a tomb. The feeling that he was not just an observer but an intruder was overwhelming. He felt a profound sense of loneliness, as if he were the last living soul in a world of ghosts. The door, just as the gates had been, was left slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside, a shiver running down his spine. The air inside was colder than outside, and a powerful sense of emptiness, a profound absence of life, filled the space. The sisters were gone. Mr. Abernathy moved with a newfound urgency, his heart pounding in his chest. He made his way directly to the studio, the room where the macabre ritual had taken place. He pushed open the door, and the sight that greeted him confirmed his gravest fears. The room was a perfect, ghostly recreation of the scene he had witnessed yesterday. The sunlight streamed through the same grimy window, illuminating the same dancing motes of dust. The canvases were still stacked against the walls, the brushes still lay scattered on the table. Eleanor's strange camera stood on its tripod, its lens a dark, unblinking eye. But the sisters were gone. Their absence was a heavy, suffocating presence, a hole in the fabric of the room. It was more than just a lack of people. It was an emptiness that felt wrong, as if they had been unmade rather than simply departed. Abernathy walked slowly around the space, touching a still damp brush, the cold brass of the camera. Everything was exactly as it had been, a tableau frozen in time, save for the two figures that should have been there. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air, leaving no trace, no struggle, no sign of what had become of them. He realized the sinister truth. The photograph had not been a record of the moment. It had been the moment itself. The click of the shutter had not captured them, it had consumed them. The camera was not a tool for creation but a device for removal, and he had been a witness to a final, desperate act of either escape or imprisonment. He looked at the empty velvet armchair where Clara had sat, and a wave of profound sorrow washed over him. He felt an intense need to find a final clue, a note, a letter, anything that could explain what madness had possessed the sisters to step into a photograph and disappear forever. Abernathy's search led him to a small, cluttered easel tucked away in a dimly lit corner of the room. It was Clara's space, a private sanctuary of her melancholic art. On the easel, an unfinished canvas stood, its surface a grim testament to her final moments. It was a portrait, but not of a person. It was a depiction of Eleanor, rendered in the same muted grays and blacks that colored Clara's other works. But this portrait was unlike the others. Eleanor's face, though recognizably hers, was a hollowed-out mask of cold determination, her eyes wide and blank, as if already seeing into a world beyond. What truly chilled Abernathy to the core were the details. The lines of Eleanor's body were faint, almost transparent, and a thin, spectral chain was painted around her neck, leading to an unseen force beyond the frame. But the most disturbing element was what Clara had been working on just before she disappeared, a single black-painted hand, its fingers extended as if reaching out to grasp the world. It was a hand that was not part of Eleanor's body, but something separate, something parasitic. Abernathy stared at the canvas, a terrible clarity washing over him. The painting was not merely a piece of art, it was a silent confession. Clara had been trying to warn him, to leave a message. Eleanor's obsession with her camera and her unique methods was not a form of artistic expression, but a desperate, final attempt at control. The painting suggested that Eleanor, in her pursuit of a forgotten power, was a slave to something dark, and that she was pulling her sister along with her. The photo Abernathy had witnessed wasn't just a trap, it was a final, terrible act of bondage. The sisters hadn't disappeared by choice. They had been consumed by the very darkness they sought to master. Abernathy stood before the unfinished portrait, the chilling truth of Clara's final message sinking into his very soul. He felt a profound sense of helplessness and grief for the two sisters he had met only yesterday, now lost to the darkness of their own making. He turned from the canvas and began to walk towards the door, ready to flee this house of ghosts. But as he did, he felt it, a shift in the oppressive silence. It was a subtle change, not a sound or a movement, but a palpable sense of a presence that was not his own. He stopped, his heart pounding. The air grew colder, and a faint, electric hum, so similar to the one he had heard from Eleanor's camera, seemed to fill the room. He felt an unseen gaze on his back, a cold, unwavering stare that was not of this world. He spun around, his eyes scanning the cluttered studio. There was nothing. The empty easel, the silent camera, the dusty jars of paint, all were still and lifeless. Yet, the feeling persisted, growing stronger, more malevolent. It was as if the room itself was alive, and its inhabitants, now trapped within the confines of the photograph, were watching him, their last connection to the world they had lost. He felt a hand brush against his shoulder, a touch so cold it burned. He flinched, but when he looked, there was nothing there. A faint whisper, like the rustle of a dead leaf, seemed to hiss from the direction of the empty velvet chair. It was a single, repeated word, "Run." A wave of terror, far more intense than any he had felt before, washed over him. He had not just walked into a house, he had trespassed into a prison for two souls, and they were not alone. Whatever dark power Eleanor had summoned to capture them was still there, watching, waiting. Abernathy knew he was no longer a witness but a potential victim. He didn't hesitate. He broke into a run, his boots pounding on the marble floors, the ghostly whisper of the sisters fading behind him as he fled for his life. Mr. Abernathy burst from the manor, not daring to look back. He ran until his lungs burned, not stopping until he was back in the safety of his rented room, the small, mundane space now feeling like a fortress. He locked the door and slid to the floor, his body shaking. He had witnessed the end of the Blackwood sisters' story, and the beginning of his own nightmare. The photograph, the one he had seen in that terrifying flash, was a dark relic, a visual coffin that held two trapped souls. He spent the next few days in a state of feverish anxiety. He packed his belongings, sold his photographic equipment to a local pawn shop for a fraction of its worth, and booked the first train back to Boston. He left Eastwich without a word, abandoning his quest for a masterpiece and leaving the chilling mystery of the manor behind. But the silence of the photograph followed him. He knew, with an unshakable certainty, that the image still existed, a single plate hidden somewhere in that cold, desolate house. And so, the story of the Blackwood sisters became a part of local legend, a quiet horror story whispered around firelit hearths. The manor, now completely abandoned, was never entered again, its windows staring out at the world like the hollow eyes of the women trapped within. Mr. Abernathy, now a broken man, never spoke of what he saw. He would become a quiet, reclusive figure, forever haunted by the two women he had seen disappear into a photograph. He knew that their souls were not at rest, but were instead living a purgatory of eternal stillness, their final, terrible story forever preserved in a single, cursed image that had cost them everything.